we're going to get started, everybody. Welcome to FailureCon, a conversation that is supposed to be about failure, but I think we're going to redefine that in a second. If we could quickly just introduce the panel. I'm Nick Hammerschlag. I'm the president of Entangled Group, and I've not failed at anything ever, so I'm not sure why I'm here. Kidding. The first business I started, everyone told me not to start it, and never identified product market fit and was too early. So that was my kind of brush with early failure. Kristen, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Kristen Hamilton. I am the, started a couple companies, and most recently sold one named Koru, which was in the talent tech space. And I now work with Entangled. Very excited to be here, and very excited to talk about failure, which my kids, I always tell them, failing is learning. So that'll be a hint in the direction that I think we might go.
Ashish?
Ashish, I am the CEO and co-founder of Benchprep. I started Benchprep 9 years ago, and the first iteration of the company was a B2C business model, which didn't really scale the way we wanted to. So that was kind of the failure that I would focus on in this conversation. Luckily, we pivoted into a B2B model, which has scaled really well. So, although it is the same company, but I almost feel like I failed on one, and now the second is succeeding.
Mr. Freedman?
I'm Paul Freedman. I'm the CEO of Entangled Group. It just occurred to me now, and we should have occurred before, that having 3 people from Entangled on a group panel failure was probably not great branding for us. So we continue to fail more. But failure I'm representing here is not my role at Entangled, at least not yet. It's my prior role as the CEO of Altius Education. Altius Education had built what at the time was something we were really proud of, Ivy Bridge College, which was a national transfer college. The idea was it was a 2-year program that articulated students to 154 nonprofit institutions. We had 2,900 students. We had 2 to 3 times the success rate of a community college at effecting transfer. We had raised $36 million in venture capital. We had $26 million revenue run rate in year 3, all successes, and that's the end of the story. So, and then due to some regulatory unfortunateness, we were essentially shut down overnight, and the business collapsed. The students were spread to the wind, and I guess that's the failure that I'm representing today.
Nelson?
So I propose the Wisdom Untangled Group. How about that?
I like that.
I'm Nelson Gonzalez. I'm the co-founder of Declara. GSV is our lead investor. We're a social learning platform, which we sold 2 weeks ago. I wish I had more details, but the press release is coming out any minute now. We sold to an IoT blockchain company, so really proud of that. And at the same time, there are ways in which we took some difficult turns. And frankly, if we had made the right turns, I'd be on a big stage right now. So definitely a lot of lessons from that, which I'm, and this is a word you'll probably hear a lot, metabolizing through work that I'm doing at Penn and through an experiment called the Whole Child Lab. So look forward to talking about scaling and founder grit.
So let's maybe start with the word failure. Is a failure a failure? Kristen, you and I were talking before that you can define it differently. How would we define kind of our experiences with failure? And do you think you're defined by it? Is it a scarlet letter? Is it a badge of honor? How do you kind of work with the term?
Well, it's become in vogue, as we all know, a little bit. Failing is learning is a concept that's not really new. But I think about when having been an entrepreneur a few times, the job is impossible, and so you're constantly banging up against this something that's going badly, or some learning that you're having and some failure that you're experiencing. So in that sense, it's positive. But I think there's 2 kinds of failure. There's the fail fast and fail cheap model of failure, which is good. So it's very humbling to say, well, I'm going to go ahead and dive into this experience, try it, and fail fast and cheap, and live that out loud. To me, that's positive and a good thing, and I've definitely experienced that kind of failure a lot on a routine basis, and that was actually one of the mantras at the company that I recently co-founded, Koru. But the less good kind of failure is the fail expensive and long. And I think that we, by not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, by not allowing ourselves to be honest about what we don't know, that's when we have the dangerous kinds of failures. And I think not admitting when we actually are having a learning that means we probably should go in a different direction, even though it's against momentum and it's against popularity. That's when I think that those are the failures that we want to avoid.
Right. And I see Paul nodding over there. I don't know if he wants to jump in, but I would say that there's probably two different elements to this conversation. There's the personal side, like which Nelson will talk about, and then there's the business side. I wonder if Ashish or Paul or Nelson want to talk about specifically if they could go back in time and talk about the 1, 2, or 3 key things that they wish they could undo or could attribute the kind of fundamental element that brought a kind of end to kind of the business activity, what those would be.
Yeah, mine's real quick, and I've thought about this a lot. So we, by the nature of our program, we were accredited in a partnership with the Ohio-based university in a deal that kind of looks like an OPM deal, although it was a little bit more complicated. And this was a few years ago, so all these things were novel. We knew that accreditation risk was a fundamental risk of the business. I had this line that I would do when I was doing pitches for the business, which was people would say, what about accreditation risk? And I'd say the following. Accreditation risk is not something I could solve for you. It's something that you have to either get over or not get over. If you're not going to get over it, you shouldn't make this investment. If you can get over it, we should talk. It's a great line, by the way. VCs love it. But I internalized that message, and we probably thought that there's a 5 to 10% chance that something could go wrong from accreditation, but to have a 5 to 10% chance that the whole business can go out of business is a bad thing to do, and it's worth figuring out an insurance policy. And there were things that we could have done to create an insurance policy. It would have been expensive, it would have been redundant, it would have driven us in a little different direction, but we got used to this systemic risk out there and didn't solve for it.
And I think entrepreneurs get to be the passing lane of society in a lot of ways, and that's a huge privilege, but it also comes with responsibility. And I think that when you have the freedom to be an entrepreneur, and particularly when you get capital, a lot of capital to move quickly, there's this dual contract that you enter into that I think we haven't defined enough in entrepreneurship. There's a contract to yourself, to your company, and a contract to your customers. And I think that was one of the hardest lessons of scaling Declara as quickly as we did. We got a $40 million Series A after a year and a half of what ASU, GSV says is a 10 to 12 year run for most tech companies. That's a lot of pressure, right, in year 2 to scale that quickly. And that contract to self, which is to your mission, to your values, and to your internal team, begins to unravel when you have to scale that quickly, particularly before you have product market fit. And if you don't have product market fit, then you can't keep a contract with your customers because you don't really know who they are. And so I think untangling some of that and really, I don't know, maybe there should be a ritual at your Series A, like here's the contract to yourself and here's the contract to your customer, boom.
Well, it's interesting, Nelson, that you kind of bring up and talk a lot about, which I think actually, strangely, a lot of people relate to on this panel, is access to too much capital would probably be a key reason that you felt there were struggles at Declara. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, $40 million is a lot before you have identified product market fit, and there's this mandate to scale, right? Because you don't get money to sort of sit and reflect and come up with a beautiful framework of how this might roll out. It's, you got 7 years if the traditional IRR metrics are put in place. And so it's like, how many engineers have you hired this week? How many engineers have you hired this week? And when you've got product market fit and you have the right metrics and you've validated those, go. When you don't, it's really difficult. So interestingly, when we go through these cycles of having very frothy times in investment centers around the world, I think it's really easy to just think capital's great. The more, the better. And actually, that can become a trap.
Right.
Yeah. I want to add something to that. I'm curious about the learning about that because I have a similar story from my first company. We went public in 2000. So we started in 97. And so the growth was astronomical. We raised $250 million and so forth. And there was, like Paul, an external force, the market turned. But what happened, and this was the personal failing that was very painful, is that when we were building the company, we were doing everything that we were encouraged to do against even the better judgment of some of our investors because they're like, this is unprecedented. Okay, let's keep going. And then the team, the company that was really behind us, and it was the best place to work and all the rest of that. And then we didn't really, there are a lot of things we didn't do, but what happened in the painful lesson was that when things went bad, so we hit the wall because after the dot-com bubble burst, we went from $71 to $1 in a year, our stock price. But the company, so nothing changed in our strategy, right? Nothing changed in our execution except that the company, the team, the market externally turned against us, but the team internally turned against us too. So we went from being like hero to zero, and it took me about 10 years of reflecting on the lesson in that. And the lesson in that, which I carried forward, is just to be intentional about, be very intentional about what you stand for as a company, your principles, is such that you can weather all the storms, because we didn't weather the storm at all. Our team literally was on Yahoo chat boards insulting us, and you could tell it was actually the internal, because they had information that only they would have. And it was a really painful lesson that it was a failing on our part for sure, and not building an intentional company and intentional culture. So
Did you feel that access to too much capital impacted any of your operations at Koru? Like you had a large seed, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. So at Koru, we had a $4.5 million seed. We pivoted though, which was really hard. So the thing that I think there's some learning there, we pivoted when we recognized that we couldn't scale fast enough as an in-person boot camp. Or we weren't scaling fast enough as an in-person boot camp, and it was actually after the A, which I think we did because we wanted to have a tech-enabled solution.
Right.
And one of my investors, who was actually a angel investor, said, you should just be patient. Like, it's just going to take a few more years to get this thing to work.
So access to capital, you thought was just what you needed. It gave you the opportunity to keep going.
The fact that we had the capital and we are venture backed said we need to grow at a certain rate and we need to be scalable. And so that was a part of our decision making around looking for something that was more scalable and more tech enabled, and therefore the pivot.
You brought up the pivot, and Ashish has I think masterfully done a pivot that was coming out of a period of kind of particularly trying time.
I also want to go back to what Kristen said about what capital does. So our story was interesting that our Series A was a $2.2 million round, so decent size for the direct-to-consumer business. And it wasn't really scaling as fast as we would have wanted to, like same story, right? But we were still able to raise. So we were able to raise a Series B round, which was a $6 million round, and with the hopes that capital would actually help us with that. So capital will help us get to that product market fit. And of course it did, right? So what ended up happening was something that could have been a fast and cheap mistake or failure now suddenly became an expensive and long, because now we have capital, now we can deploy it and prolong it for 2 more years, and that's what we did. So it took us 2 more years and unfortunately $5 million more spent to get to the point where we said, actually, this is not helping at all. So we pivoted in 2014 to a B2B model. And that was a hard pivot, and actually shutting down the company was on the table. But, again, I want to go back to what Kristen said. There were some fundamental beliefs that we had, which we could still hold on to, and said, you know what, the market hasn't changed. It's just the way we were trying to solve the problem has changed or has not worked out. So let's move from a B2C to B2B. And we almost had to, and we were like around 35 employees, and we got down to 7 in one day. Definitely the hardest thing that I've ever done. But I'm proud to say that all 7 of them are still part of the company. So that worked out well, and it's on the upswing. So it's almost like me not recognizing that I could have avoided this failure in a very cheap way and almost kind of going all in. That was the biggest deal.
And still on this topic of pivoting and raising money, did you find yourself changing or kind of like listening to investors or the market in a way that was detrimental? Did you let investors or kind of market sentiment inappropriately define your strategy and what you should have been doing? And did you feel like that contributed at all to kind of the direction you took?
I almost think that before the pivot, I was very stubborn. Right? And this is an interesting piece because as an entrepreneur, you have to be rational. You have to be stubborn. If you're rational, you won't be doing this. Odds are against you. It just won't work. So you have to be irrational, but not enough or not so much that you can't really listen to what your customers are telling you or what your board members or investors are telling you. And we just kept going all in and all in. And things that moving to this B2B model the writing was on the wall. we were going to our customers trying to, or companies and trying to license their content. And they used to be like, no, we're not interested in that, but we would love to license your platform. That was a B2B play. And we're like, no, this is not our model. I mean, this is not my vision, as against being humble and be like, if this is what the market wants, maybe I should adjust.
I see Paul nodding, by the way, over being stubborn. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, that resonated with me. It's just this weird, like stubbornness and openness and like arrogance and humility. It's like a very, conflicting job. And then I was also thinking, you should like, while you're telling that story, I was like, yeah, you should never listen to your investors. And then I was also thinking, we make investments and we want people to listen to us. So I think it's that balance is really, really, really difficult. And I think most companies that do fail in either one of those directions, and it's really a needle that you have to thread exactly right in the middle, right? You always have to listen to your customers. You should be looking for the information about the market, but you also have to believe, something is going to work really before anybody else believes it's going to work, right? Like you're out there sort of leading a parade before customers, investors, employees really think it's going to work, and so you have to have that fundamental faith.
And I know, Nelson, you have an interesting kind of take on this, because you got good kind of market signals from a first early customer as a large customer, and then you raised a lot of money, and then you spent a lot of time trying to make the business look like what investors thought it should. Is that fair to say?
Ironically, we did better than that. It was more than one large contract. There were three very large contracts, multi-year prepaid SaaS. It was pretty cool. And we actually delivered what we promised. Certainly, early customers always buy vision more than, but we actually had the V1 that was very robust. It was more in the pivoting that we didn't quite land that. And I think it's interesting, because I think we think of pivoting as I got to tweak the business model, I got to tweak the features. But it's like being in a relationship and you're about to break up and you're with a couples therapist, and it's like, and you think, I just need to change my vocabulary. No, you have to change your whole way of being, your whole posture. And I think as a company, as companies, it's hard to think of a pivot not just in terms of the mechanics, but you need to change your whole posture and stance in front of your customers. And so I think that we have a kind of superficial way of thinking about that, which I think gets to the point about balance between humility and certainty. I always, when I talk to entrepreneurs, I say it's like being on a balance beam or a tightrope, and you have to have that kind of posture to be able to make it across. And it's this balance between deep certainty in your intuition about, as a kind of artist, what has to be born in the world for you, but deep humility about who the hell knows how it's actually going to work out.
Yeah. Speaking of balance, let's pivot ourselves for a second to the more personal side of this. And Nelson, would love for you to tell us a little bit about how, when Declara came to kind of its final resolution, what you did to unwind from that process, and kind of how you dealt with kind of all the things that were going on around you, because I think you have a particularly interesting recent history.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of people in the audience who had shoulders for me to lean on around that. I find it almost cruel that, imagine going to a country where 9 out of 10 children died, and you just told the mothers, got to get on with it, got to brush yourself off. 9 out of 10 of our children die in entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, and we don't know how to mourn. And I think that's really unhealthy, that we don't know how to, again, metabolize that failure, the disappointments, because it isn't just damn, that business model didn't work, or it's B2B, now it's got to be B2C, or that feature. No, it's, as an entrepreneur, these are your babies, right? And this is your entire, again, that notion of an artist putting something out into the world that must live. That's what we're doing. And the sense that 9 out of 10 of those will die, and then we just kind of need to get on with it, I think is deeply problematic. So for me, I think what shocked me was how profound the internal dislocation was when I started to realize, shit, this is not going to go our way. And we landed it, more than landed it. We just sold our company, not so bad. But the inner, what's not going to go on the press release, is the inner experience of coming out the other side. And I think what was so fascinating is how deeply it tripped me up as a person in terms of my identity, my worth, and will I ever be employable again? And was I completely insane to ever think that I would do this? It can so mess with your sense of identity that unless you've been prepared for that, and by the way, I think we do a horrible job of preparing entrepreneurs for that part of success, you have to figure that out by yourself, and that can be a really lonely road.
What did you do when at the end of Declara you did something that was unique?
I spent about 12 days in silence in a monastery in the desert of New Mexico.
I was telling Paul Freedman that, and he was like, I wish that I did that.
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, failure sucks. It really does. And because you try so hard, you work so hard, you are out there. Failure is devastatingly humbling and past a good way. Although there's some really good aspects of it. That it's embarrassing. You let a lot of people down, and it's something to recover from. I didn't go to a monastery. That probably would have been a good idea. I don't think I've
I'm leading trips now.
I don't know that I've ever not talked for 12 minutes in a row, let alone 12 days in a row. But it sounds great. I instead do what I do in moments of dire despair, which is start new companies and start Entangled.
Ashish, yeah.
So this concept of failure is very interesting within the context of early stage startups, right? Because personal failure and business failure are so interconnected. And one of the things that I learned going through this experience was it was difficult for me to unbundle where my failure was and where did the business or the company fail. And it took me a while, and it wasn't until I was able to get back and make things work that I was able to figure out that, oh, this is my role, and there are other people who have to do their job to also collectively work towards the success of
Well,
it.
you and I have also talked about the difference between failing and giving up. Yeah. And they're two very different things. And I know, Kristen, you have thoughts on this because there are certain things outside of your control that you have to contend with, but you're not giving up. How have you thought about kind of like continuing on?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Similar to Nelson, we kind of, after the pivot, we didn't raise enough money to get to the stage where we could have raised another round. So we sort of went about trying to sell the business. And that process was really painful for a variety. I think it always is. It always looks good in the press release. But the process was very sort of exhausting. And it actually, I think, kind of put me in a state of anxiety, I would say, because you don't have the option to quit when you're an entrepreneur. So there's just not an option. And so therefore, you're sort of like every day waking up saying, how are we going to keep going? How do we land the plane? And for us, we had a failed acquisition. So there was the day of close, the buyer walked. So it was extremely kind of cataclysmic. And that day to like wake up was actually, they're on the East Coast, so it was like 4 in the morning or 3 in the morning. I was very alone. I was very by myself, very alone, and felt very alone in so many ways. And then again, there was sort of like this not option to walk away or give up. So it was like, okay, get up and go into the office. And then my co-founder came in and we just went about continuing to carry on. And so it's not heroic though. It's sort of, like it's unhealthy in a lot of ways. It's been a realization for me. I feel like Paul compelled to start these companies and to solve the problems most especially. But what I've been dealing with is sort of a resetting of my nervous system since then, and talking to a lot of other founders who are going through similar things. I'm proud of myself for having pushed myself as hard as I did. I'm in conflict because people say you're setting a good example for your daughters. And then at the same time, I'm not there for their sports things and their, so I don't really know actually where it all lands. What I did change is the personal narrative of I'm a failure. That actually, I feel like I've spent a lot of time in my life changing. So I do not believe
You don't
that
even like
I'm
the name
a
of this
failure.
panel because it's not about failure.
Well, it is. It's good. It's just reframing it. I don't. It doesn't. It's the point about separating personal, and I failed at things, but I'm not a failure, and sort of recognizing that you do your best and you keep getting up and you keep going forward, but also at some point it's unhealthy to keep going forward, and that's which been a big, huge realization for me, and to say, okay, I'm going to give myself a little breather, has been very, very, very hard. So, and that's actually been much harder. I do a lot of jigsaw puzzles. It's very therapeutic.
What are the things you're
And-
grateful for? Like, what are you grateful for about these experiences that you're kind of going to take with you in the future? Because I think a lot of this is actually what makes great entrepreneurs, is going through these hardships.
I'm really grateful for how much it's taught me to work with, depend on, lean on other people. I'm very independent, fiercely independent, but it's allowed me to say, I actually can let down my guard a little bit, and I can accept help, and I can be vulnerable. I didn't allow myself to do that for most of my life, and definitely most of my time with Koru, and I feel really good about that. And reaching out to peers like, other founders, Paul and Nick have been there for me through this. It's just been very big lesson for me in terms of being a much more vulnerable leader, and I think it makes me more powerful, actually.
Nelson, you talk about metabolizing failure and coming out on the other end better, stronger. How have you kind of metabolized this?
Yeah, well, I love your separation of failure, failing and being a failure. It reminds me of Brene Brown's, like shame versus guilt. You might do something bad, but you're not necessarily a bad person, and you might fail, but you're not a failure. We don't do a very good job of that, and I think it's partly because we lack certain practices or rituals. If you think about the military, they have after-action reviews. In Agile, you have sprint reviews. In the 12-step community, you make amends, right? There are ways of dealing with the reality of like, look, I messed up, and I'm going to learn from it, and here's the instrument for doing that. When I haven't heard of a venture capital fund having after-action reviews. I haven't heard of teams that betrayed one another making amends. Never heard of that. And so how are we supposed to not just make sense of failure or get through it, but literally metabolize it? Because these things, as we've all heard, are literally experienced at the cellular level. I love that you said that you have to reset your nervous system. That's exactly what I'm learning. And I'm really interested in this notion of somatic leadership, right? Embodied leadership, where we like step into teams, into situations with our whole selves, not just, the talking head. And if that's how we experience failure, then how do we learn if we don't actually learn it at the cellular level, which is what these practices in other communities allow us to do? So I had to borrow from those, right? I had to literally say, well, if I was, back, in the Catholic Church, how would I go to confession or go to reconciliation or do whatever, and or make amends or deal with my shame, right? But I had to make it up sort of along the way, and a little too late in some cases.
Ashish, you kind of did this while continuing on with your business. Did that make it harder, easier? Was it, infinitely more difficult? I think with a lot of people here, we've had the opportunity to take a time out and reflect and keep moving. You just kept moving.
Yeah, that was the only option. So I don't know what the other thing looks like. So that was easy. And it was hard. It was, because it wasn't just about how do I reset my nervous system and where do I get the energy from, but I also had a business to run. Right? So it was definitely more hard if I had had a clean break and could have taken some time off and started that. But on the flip side, I would say that I also had a very good purpose. Right? So now it was almost like, and it wasn't just me, it was me and the 6 other team members who were like, okay, we just went through this, now we're gonna change all this as a team. And the level of camaraderie and collaboration during those 6 months post this decision was just phenomenal. And in fact, that has been the DNA going forward. So it was definitely difficult, but I think the kind of things that we learned and we instilled in ourselves during that period defined who we became when things are going good.
As we kind of get close to wrapping up here, I'm curious, a lot of you have talked about relationships and kind of the public perception of failure. How did, Paul, you've, I think, done an extraordinary job of this. How did you kind of keep the relationships of investors and employees and partners throughout like a particularly trying time? And like, what is your philosophy on that going forward?
I worked hard at it. I was fortunate to, at least from an investor perspective, the vast majority of the people who invested in the business were supportive through the whole thing. I've heard horror stories of investors sort of yelling at founders, and I didn't have that. I had a supportive group. One thing that was interesting about our situation was it was all happening like in the public, like it was all playing out like in the press on a daily basis, and so like it was there was no hiding it from anybody. I couldn't pretend, like my friends couldn't be like, hey, what's going on in your life? Well, here, read this. But I think it does actually, that this experience does tell you who your friends really are. I mean, there's a lot of sort of fakeness in this industry, and a lot of people who are nice to founders and people they perceive to be successful for very transactional reasons, and it comes off as can come off as authentic, and you can think people are close to you and friendly. But when you're in the low points, the people who return your calls at that point in time are your real friends.
Kristen, I know you and I have also talked about kind of like the public image that people try to project around failure, and when you look on someone's LinkedIn profile, what you see versus kind of perception versus reality. Yeah. How have you kind of crafted that in the aftermath?
I mean, it's the people who don't know you. There's like there is your inner circle, and I think the people that you are comfortable letting your guard down with during your process. But it is interesting. We all have this public-facing persona and story that always looks linear and as successful as possible. And then the behind-the-curtain story for all of us is a different story. And I think that it can be, what I've learned is it's damaging for me to have too much of a disconnect there. So to be obviously I don't share all the information with everybody, but figuring out what the right conversations are to have with the different constituents in the right appropriate time was really important. Someone once said to me, your conversations are your relationship. The quality of your conversations dictate the quality of your relationships. And so with our employees, we were overly transparent, probably more than others would be, and brought them in, but not when it was too scary. And that really helped. And then, we landed the company eventually, and they were very well taken care of as best we could do. With our investors, we also, I think they saw how hard we kept working through the entire thing. So I think that.
And you guys did. You guys worked extraordinarily hard.
Just managing to maintain those relationships, I also feel very fortunate. But one of the most exciting things that happened to me in the last year was I got invited into this group called Leaders in Tech, which is started by a woman, Carol Robin, who was at Stanford GSV and ran this touchy-feely course for about 12 years. And she has left Stanford and is bringing together leaders like myself and other entrepreneurs of companies you've heard of. And we got to create a community, and they understand what I'm going through, right? I understand what they're going through. And they facilitated an environment whereby we could absolutely let our guard down and really be there for one another. So that, to me, helped me to bridge that gap. It's like this whole chest beating, like I'm crushing it, persona that we're supposed to put on in tech, it's really damaging to everybody, including ourselves. So it really shifted things for, I think, all of us in that cohort, in that group, and it was extraordinary in terms of feeling supported. And being able to say, hey, look, I'm going to show you behind the curtain. It's not all perfect. This is really messy and painful, and I did this wrong, and, just happy to be here.
All right, so last kind of comment question, lightning round for the benefit of the audience. One thing you wish you could go back in time and do differently? Starting with Nelson at the end.
Have the courage to understand that values and mission were actually being compromised, and to cut losses early.
Well, I already answered the question. So from a business perspective, it's very clear how we could have avoided the failure of the business. I do think having some conduit like what Kristen described would have been extremely helpful at the time if I could have found that.
I would say ask for help and acknowledge that this is not a you versus them conversation, but talk to other founders, talk to board members, advisors, and actually ask for help.
You kind of already answered the question, but there's one other thing.
I think just really specifically having created a culture that where it was okay to say I don't know, to not know the answer from the beginning. That was the lesson really from Onvia, was like, that is the very specific thing. If we'd said it's okay in this culture to not know the answer, then we wouldn't have pretended to know the answer when things were shaky.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think everyone could probably use a drink after talking about all this really fun stuff. And thank you, everybody, for participating.
Yeah.